Is Far Cry 3 or Team Fortress 2 the better takedown of the first-person shooter? First up, spoilers are ahead, so enter at your own risk. I've said it before, but the FPS or first-person shooter has a bit of an identity crisis. They've homogenized into a kind of militant blob of cliches about the honor of war, killing stereotypical enemy soldiers, and being a man. It's gotten a little out of hand, so much so that shooters like Spec Ops: The Line, Far Cry 3, and Team Fortress 2 have gotten a whiff of the absurdity and said, wait a minute, this is a little bit weird. Now, it might seem a little hypocritical for a shooter to critique other shooters, but it's actually pretty common in media. The Daily Show is a news show that satirizes the news. Scream was a horror movie that satirized other horror movies, and I'm pretty sure that The Fast and the Furious 6 is a scathing satire of the concept of Fast and Furious, but you know, it all gets very heady. Anyway, a special thanks goes to Miguel Roth, whose very kind and thoughtful email inspired this episode. Extra Credits already did a fantastic episode on Spec Ops: The Line, Miguel, so you should check that out. I'm going to focus on Team Fortress 2 and Far Cry 3. Both games take shots at the warmongering as usual in the first-person shooter genre. So which game did it better? Bro, great wig there, buddy. First up is Team Fortress 2, the team-based shooter with a cast of zany characters. As you can tell by my B- cosplay, I'm partial to Scout. Sweet. Like Call of Duty and Battlefield, the game is hugely popular, but its take on the genre is colored with lighthearted mockery. So how does Team Fortress 2 comment on the overwrought first-person shooter? One way is through style. Instead of using grittiness to show realism, Team Fortress 2 turns everything into a brightly colored cartoon. A top hat stacked on top of a propeller hat stacked on top of a fedora is certainly fashionable, but you're really not going to wear it into battle. Another is how it depicts violence. Shooters often serve up these incredibly gruesome, unreal depictions of death. But Team Fortress 2 does them one better. It uses amazing, over-exaggerated ragdoll physics sequences when you die. Headshots cause decapitations, the whole thing's totally nuts. There's also the mechanics. In other realistic shooters, you have unrealistic gameplay elements like invisible walls and enemy spawn points. Team Fortress 2 just slaps a big "do not enter" sign on them to make fun of itself. Both a critique and a love letter, Team Fortress 2 cracks wise that realistic shooters aren't even close. No shooter has caused me so much laughter. Far Cry 3, on the other hand, bro, takes a different tone. This is very serious, young man. It says with a wagging finger. So, how does Far Cry 3 comment? One way is through characterization. Instead of playing as a rookie soldier, you play as Jason Brody, a millennial everyman thrust into the role of mercenary. It seems to be saying to the player, you're not a killer, you're an individual who plays beer pong. So what's with all the violence and the killing and the death? Also, in its plot progression. In shooters, you always start weak and end up strong. It's the same arc every time, right? But Far Cry 3 shines a condescending light on this transformation. After you kill your arch nemesis Voss, for instance, there's this weird, almost hallucinogenic scene of mock praise about how powerful you've become. It lays it on pretty thick.
I only want to help you, to love you for who you are, to worship the man you have become.
Then there's the choices you make. You can go hang gliding, skin wild animals, play poker, and get sweet tats, bro. Rescue my friends? I'll get to it, I promise. The game seems to be suggesting this killing thing, maybe it's not for you. And don't forget the final choice, where you can choose to leave or you can stay on the island forever and live out your fantasies as a warlord. But if you choose to stay, then Jason gets stabbed to death in this really strange sex sequence with Citra, the rival gang leader. What the game is really saying is, this is what you truly deserve for pursuing the path of violence, you self-centered millennial jerk. Pretty harsh. And what's weird is while these games are totally different, they make a surprisingly similar point about how shooters present a false view of reality. How's that possible? Well, Team Fortress 2 and Far Cry 3 are actually perfect examples of two different kinds of satire. But first, before we continue, what is satire? Basically, satire is when a wrong in society is held up for ridicule in a creative work. There are two main types of satire: Horatian, named after the Roman satirist Horace, and Juvenalian, named after the Roman poet Juvenal, or as we might call it, Scoutian and Brodian. Horatian satire tends to be lighthearted and poke fun at its subject, turning it from something serious into an object of ridicule. You see this with a show like South Park or The Onion. Juvenalian satire tends to be much more scathing and exposes the dark underbelly of its subject. So think of a book like Fahrenheit 451 or a film like Apocalypse Now. Team Fortress 2 sits definitively on the Horatian end of the scale. It goes overboard with its tropes to be funny, so it's a lot closer to a comedic roasting of the shooter. But it's also a critique of the ridiculous self-seriousness of shooters like Titanfall and Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. Because of its lightheartedness, Team Fortress 2 comes off as a positive statement. Sure, shooters are smeared with blood and testosterone, but ultimately that's just an accessory. At their heart, shooters are just fun games. Far Cry 3, conversely, is 100% Juvenalian. It does this other kind of satire that's way more scathing, implying that shooter tropes are pretty twisted when you think about it. It reveals shooters as these millennial power fantasies completed by people who have no concept of true violence. The game invites you to play what looks like another fun shooter and then spins it around to ask you this question: why do you enjoy this stuff in the first place? So which one do I think is a better satire? Well, critics generally applaud Far Cry 3 for challenging conventions, and I agree. Plus, it's a lot of fun. But to me, it doesn't really seem fair. You can't complete the game without doing all the bad stuff it's ostensibly opposed to. With that said, I am excited to see what Far Cry 4 does next. So for now, my vote goes to Team Fortress 2. Round of applause. It's a really fun game, and it shows you how ridiculous the shooter genre actually is.
Baby, don't hurt me no more.
So what do you all think? Which game is a better satire of the first-person shooter genre? Far Cry 3 or Team Fortress 2? Hash it out in the comments, and if you like what you saw, please subscribe. I'll see you next week. Last week we asked whether League of Legends, and by extension esports in general, should be considered a high school or collegiate sport. Let's see what you had to say. Matthew T worries that if esports replaces physical education in the United States, then America's obesity epidemic will go through the roof, at least more than it already does. I mean, I don't know, frankly, if you look at fast food in this country, we don't need a lot of help in that department. Regardless, I'm not saying that esports should be the only thing that kids do to fulfill their physical education requirement. Only that a lot of the things, the values that you find in esports in terms of like hard work, teamwork, these sorts of things that we value in physical education writ large, those are things that we can sort of push in esports. But yeah, you're right. I mean, look, I'm not saying that 40 hours a week kids should just be playing video games instead of basketball. I'm just saying that that should be part of a larger regimen of physical education, and I think that would be really exciting for the kids. Commenter for Looming quotes the artist Barnaby Conrad, who said that only mountain climbing, bullfighting, and auto racing are sports. Everything else is just games. What Conrad, I think, is getting at is that real sports are things in which you sort of face your own mortality, things that might lead to your own death. So something like surfing, for example, might be a part of that as well. Whereas games are just a simulation of that sort of epic battle of man versus man, or man versus beast, or man versus nature. So a game like chess ultimately is not much different from a game like football, and that both are simulations of the art of war. Really great comment. I hadn't thought about it that way, but only points to how the nature of the very act of trying to define what's a sport and what's a game leads us to some very cool and interesting philosophical ponderings. UsurperKingZant, all hail King Zant, agrees that esports count as sports, but has one specific reservation, and it's actually a good one. King Zant worries that if we turn esports into an official high school activity, then they'll lose all of the fun. And actually, there's a precedent for this. So when basketball was created by James James Naismith at the turn of the 19th century. The whole point of basketball was to get kids who were kind of like reckless youth to get them to self-organize and learn to play the game themselves. Naismith was very specific about the fact that he did not want coaches involved because he felt like coaches would lead to professionalization, and professionalization would sort of diminish the emergent joy that came from playing a sport like basketball. So yeah, I mean, it is a good question about whether or not the increasing professionalization of, you know, big esports like League of Legends or Dota 2 maybe over the long term might diminish their sort of joy. It doesn't have the same kind of, I don't know, ragtagness of like a pickup game of football. But yeah, great comment. TheJaredLong goes way back to the early origins of the word sport, to its original French definition, which was disport, which is another way of saying leisure. And in fact, as Jared Long points out, the aristocracy would use this term when they would sort of shoot a wild animal or something and then send a dog out, or, you know, a trained animal to go retrieve it and then bring it back. So early sports were incredibly leisurely. They were just as leisurely and just as, you know, quote unquote lazy as you might think of esports are today. And Jared points out that competitive fun is kind of how we should define sports. Yeah, it's a great definition. Way to go back to the etymological roots. In addition to all these wonderfully produced episodes, I've also been doing some weekly kind of vloggy things where I can deal with more timely topics. Last week we dealt with Gamergate, which has been roiling the world of video games and elsewhere. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And Gamergate, for those of you who don't know, is, well, it's a lot of things, but there's a lot of stuff about whether or not it's about corruption of journalism and ethics, or it's about the treatment of women. Regardless, I wanted to deal with one comment that I thought was emblematic of some of the things that other commenters said. But you should check out the episode first, obviously. So Ebon Hawk said something that I think was emblematic of what a lot of other commenters said. Ebon invokes the transitive property from mathematics, stating that because Hitler is a person and we are all people, therefore we are all Hitlers. So it doesn't quite make sense. I appreciate the effort. It also reminds me of Godwin's law, which states that any internet discussion of a certain length will invariably invoke the name of Hitler and Nazis in the service of trying to make someone's point. What I was trying to say, and what I think a lot of people were basically saying, was that if one person from my group does something really bad in the name of that group, does that make me as bad as that particular person? And the answer is no, of course not. The distinction is that Hitler was a Nazi. So if you're a member of the Nazi party, then it would be very hard for you to make the case that Nazism is about something other than the things that we all know Nazism is for. And that's very similar to the argument that I was making about Gamergate, specifically that you can be a Gamergate person who believes that Gamergate is about journalism and ethics. It's about those types of things, and that very well may be true, but you have to reckon with the fact that there are many people in the name of the movement that you belong to who are doing some really, really terrible things. And the rest of the world believes that the movement that you are a part of is representative of like larger bullying and, you know, terrorizing women on the internet. So the question is, for you, if you're someone who believes in Gamergate, is how you're going to deal with those members of your particular group. And that's a question that unfortunately only you can answer.